Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, America's citadel of free speech for a century. My name is Sanjeev Kapoor, and I am a past president of the City Club. This week, yet another lawyer is being prosecuted for lying. Senator John Edwards, who spoke before this forum in 2004 when he was running for vice president, is being tried on 6 counts, including one for making false statements. Prosecutors allege Edwards orchestrated a scheme to use campaign funds to conceal his relationship with filmmaker Real Hunter. One of our speakers today, who also spoke here in 2004, first raised the issue of ethics and lawyers when he was testifying before the Senate Watergate Committee. At that time, he handed the committee a list of 16 individuals in the Nixon administration who had broken the law. When asked by Senator Talmadge why more than 2/3 of the names had asterisks by them, Mr. Dean replied that each was a lawyer. He then told the senators, "How in God's name could so many lawyers get involved in something like this?" John Dean, who was born in nearby Akron, Ohio, became counsel to President Nixon in July of 1970 at the young age of 31. During the summer of 1972, Mr. Dean supervised the payment of hush money to those involved in the Watergate break-in. After President Nixon was reelected and the Watergate scandal began to unravel, Mr. Dean became convinced that he would be made a scapegoat of the scandal, especially when President Nixon refused his request for immunity for his involvement in Watergate. Mr. Dean then began to cooperate with the Senate Watergate Committee. In June of 1973, Mr. Dean became the first Nixon administration official to publicly accuse President Nixon of involvement in the Watergate cover-up. President Nixon, of course, denied those accusations, and initially it became an issue of whose word the public should trust. Mr. Dean did not know, but suspected that President Nixon was taping conversations in the White House. His prodding of the staff of the Senate Watergate Committee led them to uncover the existence of the White House tapes, which corroborated his accusations. Since the Watergate era, Mr. Dean has been an investment banker, a political commentator, and a prolific writer of books, not only relating to the Watergate scandal, but on diverse topics such as the nomination of Justice Rehnquist, the U.S. conservative movement, his mentor, Senator Barry Goldwater, and President Warren G. Harding, who was born in Northeast Ohio just like Mr. Dean. Most recently, Mr. Dean has been touring the country with our other speaker, James D. Robenalt, teaching lawyers about ethics based on the lessons of Watergate. Mr. Robenalt is a partner in the Cleveland office of Thompson, Hine. He is a business litigator who tries multi-million-dollar contract, trade secret, tax, and construction law cases. He is also the author of 2 nonfiction books, including one on President Harding, which is the topic of common interest that first brought our 2 speakers together. Please join me in giving John Dean and James Robenalt a warm City Club welcome.
I should, first of all, tell you how delightful it is to be back for an Encore appearance here. I was here the last time with a book in 2004, in August of 2004, and talked about a book called Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush. And sold a lot of copies here, as a matter of fact, which surprised me. Jim, who I met at that time, he and I stayed in touch over the years, and not too long ago, December of last year, he was taking a CLE, continuing legal education class, up here in Cleveland. It was on Kent State. And he sent me a note or a text or a call, or I'm not sure which it was now, and said, you know, John, you talk about Watergate at CLEs from time to time, so maybe you should put one together just for the fact we're coming up on the 40th anniversary. And I, somewhere along the line, made a crack to Jim, knowing that he is very busy as a trial attorney. In fact, he got permission from the judge today to come over here. He's in the middle of a trial right now. So we'll end on time, and he'll go right back to his case, which has been fairly protracted. But anyway, I thought Jim would say no. And he said, no, that sounds like a good idea. Let's put it together. We actually spent 6 months sifting through Watergate. I sent him a lot of primary material. He'd read some of the secondary material, and we put together initially a 4-hour, it's also a 3-hour, also a 2-hour program, and we're going to give you about a half-hour sample of it today because we think there's some little nuggets in here that you will appreciate, particularly after Sanjay's introduction. It's not to teach or preach about ethics. It's to show how the bar is rather unique. In all the post-Watergate reforms, only the bar, the professional bar, has retained those reforms. Investigative journalism, you recall, became very popular after Watergate. It's, for all practical purposes, gone. I mean, unless there's special funds or what have you, reporters don't have the time to do it. They've got too much on their plate, and so there's not much of that. We had an independent counsel act. It was recommended by the Senate Watergate Committee. It's vanished. After it gored both parties sufficiently, the Congress decided not to renew it. There were lots of campaign finance laws. They've been changed by the Supreme Court with Buckley versus Viejo and Citizens United and other cases, that all those reforms are virtually gone. The one thing that has stayed is that the professional bar has demanded that lawyers be sensitive to the ethics, and we found that by looking at the first week of what happened at Watergate, there was so much material to work from, that we could show just about everything you don't want to do that first week. So from that, Jim and I are going to give you a little highlight of what we do. We've traveled around Ohio. We've actually traveled all over the United States doing this. We don't exactly have a very good marketing department at this point, but word of mouth has taken us to 4 corners of the country so far, and more are on tap for this year.
So to set this up, remember that we're now 40 years ago. June of 1972 is the Watergate break-in. And so we're going to be celebrating that 40th anniversary coming up. Now think about John Dean at that time. He comes back from the Philippines. He goes to the White House, and he's told there's been a break-in at the Watergate. And he's a young lawyer. He is 34 years old.
No, it's only 32 then.
Okay, he's 32 years old.
I was actually 50 when I left.
So, he spends that entire day taking confessions from Gordon Liddy, John Mitchell, Ehrlichman, Colson, all these people he meets with that day, and we talk about that in, what he was told that day. But as a lawyer, you have a duty of obligation of confidentiality. And so he's learning about crimes that have happened. He's learning all about the whole story. He and Gordon Liddy take this famous walk down 17th Street. And
right beside the White House.
Sit on a park bench, and Liddy confesses everything to him. And then tells John that if you want to, you can shoot me on the street corner. And John said,
I don't think it's time, Gordon. That actually might have been one of my first mistakes in the cover-up.
So in any event, this is what's happening. Now, back then, as a lawyer, you could not reveal your client's crime. You could sit back and try to convince them to do otherwise. You were under a pretty heavy duty of confidentiality. So all you could really do was quietly resign. Change what you're doing, or I'm gonna quietly resign. There's no leverage there. The rules then changed over time, and they changed directly because of the testimony we're about to show you that John gave back at the time that was set up very nicely in the introduction. And it changed because people in the country said, is this true? Lawyers have an absolute duty of confidentiality even when crimes are going on? And the answer is today, lawyers do have different rules. Under some circumstances, they can report out in a situation like this.
What we found particularly interesting was by taking the rules that evolved out of Watergate, applying them back to what happened that first week and in other times, you really get some different results. Not only the sensitivity to the issues that we should have been sensitive to, but the way that, as a lawyer, I could have dealt with my superiors. I was very confused, for example, about who my client was. Was it Richard Nixon? No, it really wasn't Richard Nixon, even though I thought so, and I think he thought so, because he was giving me a lot of personal work, estate planning matters to send off to other lawyers. that were working on it, so it was very confusing. And it's clear today that I represented not the president himself, but the office of the president, and that makes a huge difference.
All right, so here's what we show people in our class. We can take a look at this. We concentrate on the week following the break-in. This is Herman Talmadge, who you heard about in the introduction. John is testifying in front of the Senate Watergate Committee in June of 1973. So it's a year later. He had gone over to report, what was going on. And Talmadge was one of the people who questioned him.
Actually, Talmadge is a former prosecutor and asked good questions. He noticed one of my exhibits where I had listed to my lawyer the lawyers, as I talked with him about the criminal law and its application, who was involved in the sort of the planning, the pre, and who was involved in the post activities. We'll blow this up for you so you can see it, but those are literally my notes, my abbreviated notes that ended up as part of the material that was subpoenaed by the Senate.
All right, and so set this up just a little bit so you all know the significance of this testimony. That week, John testified an entire week in June. All three networks carried it. His testimony made PBS because people would come home at night who were, wanted to watch the whole thing on PBS that night. They all carried it simultaneously. He was the only one where the entire week was him. If you turned on CBS, ABC, or NBC, 85 million people tuned in. Everybody in the country.
It destroyed my low profile and my wife's, because the cameraman could find her too, and as an attractive woman, they tended to put the camera on her. A lot more attractive than I am.
I'm not going to show you the photograph, but we've got a photograph we show people. That week, John Lennon and Yoko Ono showed up to watch John testify.
Actually, when Jim found that photo in our research, he's an accomplished musician, and he said, you know something? With John Lennon there and his wife, this was really a serious historical event.
Very true. All right, so this is a document that John gave to the prosecutors to say who was involved in it. And then we have a clip here of his testimony that we can bring up. And you'll see, you all remember Sam Ervin, the great Sam Ervin, and that's Howard Baker next to him. Look further down, you see
that's Fred Thompson, who's now doing, he went on to become a senator, and now he's doing reverse mortgages for America.
All right, so we'll see if this actually, if I can get this started here. Tell me if you can hear this or not. We've got a mic on it.
Now, will you look at exhibit number 43, which you inserted in your testimony yesterday? That's also an interesting document. As I recall your testimony as you presented it yesterday, it's a list of all of the people that you thought had violated the law and what the laws may be that they violated. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Let's start with the top of the list. Now, that's in your own handwriting, is it not?
That is correct.
This is a copy thereof.
That is correct.
What is the significance of the letters at the top left-hand part of that sheet?
The list is broken down into two parts, Senator. One says pre, and the other is post. This was
By pre, you mean prior to the Watergate break-in?
That is correct.
The planning and execution of those events.
That is correct.
And you list in that category Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Magruder, and Mr. Strawn.
That is correct.
Now you have a star by Mr. Mitchell's name, no star by Mr. Magruder.
Well, let me understand. Maybe if I explain the whole
Sure.
list, it would save some questions for you. I have listed for pre Mitchell, Magruder, Strawn. Post Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean, LaRue, Mardian, O'Brien, Parkinson, Colson, Bittman, Kalmbach, Tony. That's the word source. I'll explain that in a minute. Stands. Now, beside several of the names, after I did the list, I said just my first reaction was that there certainly are an awful lot of lawyers involved here. So I put a little asterisk beside each lawyer, which was Mitchell, Strawn, Ehrlichman, Dean, Mardian, O'Brien, Parkinson, Colson, Bittman, and Kalmbach.
star?
Those
They're
are
all lawyers?
no. That was just a reaction myself to the fact that how in God's name could so many lawyers get involved in something like this?
He just couldn't get stars and asterisks straight. But anyway, what happened as a result of that testimony, members of the American Bar Association, a fellow named Robert Kutak, who had been a friend of mine on Capitol Hill, was asked by the ABA to set up a commission to study, and they had not, but only recently, done some reforms on the rules of professional conduct. But Bob took on this task, and but for his effort, they probably might not have been changed, but they were changed. A model code was developed which made rather dramatic changes in the ethics requirements for lawyers both in and out of government, and they would have very much influenced what happened in Watergate.
So the bottom line on this for lawyers is that over time our rules have become clearer that when you have a situation, especially where you represent an organization, that if you find wrongdoing or fraud within that organization, you now have duties to report up in that organization, all the way to the very top, whether it's the board of directors or special audit committee, CEO, you have that duty to report up. And then if you're not satisfied with what's going on, you have to report out. So we use John's situation. When he sat with Liddy told him a past crime of the Watergate break-in. He also told him, and that's not the client, because that's the committee to re-elect the president doing that. But Liddy also was involved in the break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in Los Angeles 8 months earlier with some of these same Cubans who were involved in the Watergate break-in.
Who were then in jail as a result of the Watergate break-in.
So he's learning a past crime for his client. Liddy then says, these guys are soldiers, they won't talk, and John, you got to help me out with this. So he's now learning of a plan for future crime, which is hush money payment. So a lawyer in his situation today would be able to get all the way to the top and say, this is going on, we got to stop it. And if not satisfied, go out to the prosecutors.
Let me bring you up to date on something I've discovered in all the years since. One of the things I was convinced would happen as a result of Nixon's tapes is that all the key tapes would become publicly available as they were released by the archives. The Watergate prosecutor, they prepared when they succeeded with U.S. versus Nixon to get about 80 conversations, of which they made transcripts. Many of them were used in the trial of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and the others. The others were just rough drafts by the FBI. Stanley Cutler, a historian, got a hold of about 320 Watergate conversations. That's about 400 conversations. I figured that was probably the good stuff. My publisher convinced me to go back into this subject only recently, and I'm back into it now with both feet. I probably know more about Watergate today than when I lived through it. And one of the things I first did was try to catalog the Nixon tapes, because they're obviously such a key primary source. And they're really quite surprising what I've found. First of all, we don't have but a small sample of the conversations. While we have about 400 transcripts, partial transcripts or full transcripts, there are almost 2,000 clear Watergate-related conversations. So you can see a lot. It was pretty much the effort of the prosecutors to pull out what they thought might be relevant, and no one at the White House was helping them. So there's a whole other slew of conversations. About 900 of them, to me, are really important. I've had a team of transcribers, graduate students, and a legal secretary working on these now for a couple of years, and we're pretty well along. And it's been a real revelation about what Nixon did know and when did he learn it. And it's not quite what the public thinks. There are going to be some surprises here. The other thing is that I knew Nixon pretty well. Nixon is like a chameleon. He's very different with each member of the staff. He's one person with Chuck Colson. He's not somebody else with Bob Haldeman. Somebody else with John Ehrlichman. He's somebody else with me. So it's been very interesting to watch him in action with all the different members of the staff and how he deals with these issues. I must also say, and we hear a lot of the bad of Nixon. The archives in processing these tapes has done a good job. It's very difficult. I'm able to go in and digitize them. They were analog originally. I'm able to digitize them, do some cleanup on them, which makes them a little bit more audible, but they're still tough to prepare transcripts. One of the things that's happened, all the personal stuff relating to Nixon was supposed to be pulled out of the tapes. It didn't happen. Stuff that's very personal has been left in the stuff I found. And it's a shame there's not more of it, because I've heard a side of Richard Nixon I didn't even know existed. His relationship with his wife is much different than I thought. It's very warm. It's very loving. For example, when I was queuing up tapes for my transcribers to prepare, I heard a conversation with Nixon calling his wife, Pat, right after he gets word from Kissinger that they think they've got a settlement in Vietnam. Who's the first person he calls? His wife. And tells her how pleased he is, and she's very excited for him, and they have this lovely conversation. I've heard conversations between Julie and Tricia and the president. It's a very loving father-daughter relationship. So there's another dimension to this man, and I keep thinking when the family heard the not-so-pleasant tapes, they had to be shocked. And I'm going to try to work a little bit of that in the story as I explain. I'm not doing a book of transcripts, but it forms the spine of the book I'm working on. I think it'll help fill in some of the image we have of this man.
It really is quite an unusual treasure in the presidency, because the taping system was on for just a given period of time here. And so every day it was voice activated, whereas in the past, Lyndon Johnson would push a button to activate it. You've got everything. So John has written a wonderful book on the Rehnquist appointment and used the tapes. Beautiful. It's a great book. I highly recommend it, The Rehnquist Choice. But you really get something out of these books, because you never again will have this sort of record, this all-inclusive record of what the tapes say and so forth. So
I'm doing something very similar that I did with the Rehnquist tapes, is rather than make them transcripts, I'm using them as the basis for dialogue, where every word that is said is actually from a statement that was made, but it's made in a more conversational sense. I clean up the ahs and the ums and the interjections that happen in normal conversation and make it flow, and it works much better. So it's been interesting.
Let me tell you one thing. Well, first of all, every time John tells this story to our crowd about doing the Nixon tapes, he says he's listening to them and hearing different things. And your punchline with everyone is...
I have a different punchline for every story. But anyway, I think the one he's thinking of is I did tell Mo something when I started on this project. You know, you listen to them. I actually am not using the headphones as I had to when they were still at the National Archives. You can actually take them out now. So I have two big speakers in my office that I listen to the first drafts my transcribers have prepared. And I told Mo when I was working on this one night, I went back home, and I said, Mo, you know, so I've got this recurring almost nightmare that happens as I work on this project. I said I have this fear that the last, the deans in their 70s start losing their hearing, the men in my family. And I said, I just hope the last voice I hear is not Richard Nixon.
So let me switch gears. We got about 5 minutes left before we go to the Q&A. But let me tell you, having worked with John now on this project extensively, why he is truly an American hero. He was a young man. He faced a situation he got involved in. He took responsibility for his involvement. He goes in to see the president in March of 1973. You can listen to this online. It's the Cancer on the Presidency talk. And he goes and he says, Mr. President, you have a cancer growing on your presidency, and you have to stop it. And the president says, you know, how much money do you think we need to get these guys? And he says $1 million, and Nixon says, we can do that. So he realizes that it's not going to stop. He realizes he's been involved in wrongdoing. And he goes, and as he's put it many times, he blows himself up. He goes to the prosecutors and, essentially, he will take his medicine, but he's going to stand up to this. And it's an extraordinary thing. When he gives that testimony in June of 1973, nobody knew, except about 3 people on the earth, that there was a taping system. John had said to the investigators that he thought he was being taped at one point, but he wasn't sure, and he actually puts that in his testimony. That leads to the identification of Alexander Butterfield, who then identifies, yes, there is a taping system. And then the big fight for the whole year with the Saturday Night Massacre being, Archibald Cox being fired and the Supreme Court finally saying the tapes come out. But when he gave that testimony, it was him against the President of the United States. And the courage to do that and to take that on and to take on this whole issue is extraordinary. It's hard for me to imagine, especially at that very young age. So if you could give him a round of applause, I think he really is an American hero.
I did get to live in the witness protection program. Mo had mixed emotions about that. They're with you 24 hours a day, several of the U.S. Marshals, and Mo reminded me after they left, she said, you never helped me with the groceries. Those guys always helped me with the groceries when I came home. So she saw some positives in it as well.
Right. So the other thing that I think would be really worth spending a few minutes on as we conclude this little discussion here is, I think that people in this country have very mixed feelings about lawyers. Over time, the legal profession has been seen in a bad light in many ways, and in many ways it deserves it. But by the same token, in this case, in Watergate, the rule of law prevailed. And what you have is, as John puts this, and you can end with this discussion, is you got people who did the wrong thing, but there are also lawyers who did the right thing in this situation. So I think that would be worth... A
striking number of lawyers did the right thing. So it wasn't by my count, some 21 lawyers, and I've heard it as high as 28 lawyers, but I have some debate on the other 7. Got on the wrong side of the law during Watergate, which is a phenomenal number when you think about it. But there were probably equally that many number, if not more, who were on the right side of the law. People in the U.S. Attorney's Office, the initial prosecutor, Earl Silbert, and his assistants, and people in the FBI, people in the Watergate Special Prosecutor. Always standing out in my mind is my friend Elliot Richardson, who became Attorney General and was asked to fire Archibald Cox, the former Solicitor General who'd been hired as special prosecutor. And Elliot, as a matter of principle, refused to do so, as did his deputy, Bill Ruckelshaus. These were very bold decisions at the time, and they showed that lawyers could do the right thing as well as the wrong thing, because it's really the lawyers also who unraveled the mess. Which was important. What we've tried to do with the CLE is to take this historical episode and incident and show that it really still has lingering and real lessons for people today. We've been pleased that while we get virtually all lawyers, many of the people where we've done the event have brought their wives who are not lawyers, who find it still an interesting part of history that they want to hear more about. So we appreciate your coming today and listening to a very condensed version of what we do, and now be happy to answer any of your questions.
I think he's got to do announcements first.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to an Encore Speakers Forum featuring John Dean, former White House counsel for the Nixon administration, and Jim Robenalt, attorney at Thompson, Hine, discussing the ethics of Watergate. We will return to our speakers in a few minutes for the traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate questions for our speakers now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. The Encore Speaker Series is one event in our year-long 100th anniversary celebration, where we invite back to our podium speakers who made an impact from our stage, echoing around the world over the past decade. Our next Encore Speaker Series will be held next week, April 26th, when we welcome back to the podium Jim Wallace, editor-in-chief of the Sojourner magazine. On May 18, the City Club will hold a program to bestow our highest recognition, the Citadel of Free Speech Award. This year, media mogul and philanthropist Ted Turner will receive the award. This event will be held at noon at Sammy's Metropolitan Ballroom at 925 Euclid Avenue. To learn more about this and other 100th anniversary events, visit the City Club website at www.cityclub.org/100. We are pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by Hawkins School. Thank you for joining us today. Now we would like to return to our speakers for our traditional City Club questions and answers period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today is City Club Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Mr. Dean, at the time of the Nixon administration, you as a young Republican were a very prominent part of that administration, played a very important role. In a few months, the Republican National Convention will be held to select a President of the United States and provide also for a platform. If by any chance you were invited to come to that convention, what advice would you give to the Republican Party?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the end of the question.
I say, if,
what would I give?
If by any chance...
Well, first, before I turn to your question, which is a good, very fair question, hearing that Ted Turner is going to come and visit you, I flashed on something I should share with you. I've known his ex-wife, Jane Fonda, for a number of years, and Jane tells me that Ted is her favorite ex-husband. My advice to, first of all, I for years, in California, when you register, where I am registered to vote, you can make a decision as to whether to be affiliated with the Republicans or the Democrats or not declare, which in essence becomes an independent. Ever since living in California, and I've been there 40 years now, almost, or 38 years, I decided to not declare, so I'm in that great category of independence. I lean left on some issues, I lean right on other issues. I'm not an ideologue by any stretch of the imagination. I barely recognize what the base is doing and driving, the way they're driving the Republican Party today. It's very different from my day. I suspect Richard Nixon would be considered a rhino, a Republican in name only, because of his policies. He is well left of center today, Nixon. Even Barry Goldwater, who I did a biography with his son, an autobiography or biography. It was, I say, autobiographical in that we relied on his diary, which was a remarkable document that none of those who'd worked on his earlier books seems to have discovered, and it really is the essence of the senator. And he was by today's standard, he is left of center too. And he was very worried in his later years about the movement he had started, having gone to what he considered was the radical edge. So my advice, if they ask me, and they're not going to, I guarantee you, would be that they try to get back somewhere towards the center, where I think most people reside in America. We've never flown well on one wing or the other, but rather we're something of a centrist nation, and that seems to be where the government works the best, is when we take care of the center. But as I say, they won't ask me.
Thanks for coming today. I'm an attorney in Cleveland and was actually in law school when you were testifying and was riveted to every minute. Those of us who are lawyers, and I think in almost every profession there are rules of professional conduct, but as we all know, ultimately it's a personal question of integrity and courage as to what to do when it's really, really difficult. Can you share with us what you went through personally at that young age in the face of the President of the United States to your making your decision to do what you did?
Yeah, there's no question by the time you get through law school, you know the difference between right and wrong. When I took the ethics course I took in law school was very, very brief and like a quarter of a credit. And what they really taught you was don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, and don't advertise. Those were pretty much the norms of the profession at the time. A little bit on conflict of interest, but not much. It's far more expensive today. But you're right. You do know the difference between right and wrong. And some of the things that I saw, for example, I had a reporter who just actually, who's doing a piece for the ABA Journal that asked for some follow-up questions about when I happened to mention to him that one of the first things upon learning of Liddy's confession and the fact that he said, yes, this is my operation, yes, several of those are my men involved in a break-in for the Watergate. I told Ehrlichman, who was one of my nominal superiors, I said, John, I know nothing about the criminal law, and it sounds like we need a good criminal lawyer. That's very true. In that particular administration, it was essential you had a good criminal lawyer, which is experience I didn't have. He was not interested in my suggestion at all. One of the things I'm discovering on the tapes, and one of the things was to a degree evident to me when I started having a one-on-one relationship on this subject with the president, which was well into the cover-up, where the break-in occurs on June 17th of 72. I don't start dealing with him until late February of 73. So we're 6-7 months in that he starts asking me to deal with these issues because he wants Haldeman and Ehrlichman to work on the reorganization plans for the second term and what have you. One of the first things that I pick up is he doesn't really know what's going on. He knew more than I thought, than he was letting on to me. I now know from other tapes. But one of the striking things I'm learning now in going through the tapes in this very systematic way where I follow the thread of every single conversation on the subject is how little he was told, which was essential information that he should have had to make decisions early. And this was by, as I say, my nominal superior who had been White House counsel, John Ehrlichman, who in a couple conversations very early, right after he comes out of meeting on this subject, didn't tell him anything. When I finally start dealing with him and realize he doesn't know, I figure I've got to get his full attention and make sure that he makes the decisions that I think he should make. And that was my so-called cancer on the presidency conversation, where I really laid it out as brutally as I could. I did that to get his attention. Sometimes when I would go in the office, his feet would be up on the desk and he'd look at me around his shoes. And after I said there was a cancer on his presidency, I noticed that both feet were square on the ground and I had his full attention. And then I went through one after another the problems. And he had answers for each one. For example, I said at one point, Bud Krogh, who was another young aide, had been selected to be Undersecretary of Transportation. And I said, Bud, had told me he was worried he may have committed perjury because he was in charge of the plumbers unit and was asked some questions around it. And he said, I tried to tell the truth, but I'm not sure I did. And Nixon's response to me was, well, John, perjury's a tough rap to prove. I'm not sure you should worry about that. He had sort of those sort of answers for everything I raised. After that, I realized I really couldn't effectively serve him. I'm not sure that isn't the first day I didn't really meet who Richard Nixon was. Before that, it was much more staged. He would later record in his diary that I really had come in and laid it out for him. He would write in his memoir, I was the only one who seemed inclined to warn him of the problems. And while he was not very happy with me for telling the truth, I thought I was a traitor for doing that, he did give me credit for at least giving him a heads up that there was we were in a lot of trouble and there was a lot ahead. It wasn't advice he wanted to follow. So, yes, I think that the technical rules of evidence or of ethics have changed the game, but we know right from wrong. And the way they've changed the game, and this is one of the things we emphasize in this first week, is they would have given me leverage I didn't have. I would have liked to have alerted the president, but I had to report through Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And with the rules today in representing an entity rather than the president himself, I could have really pushed the issue, and I would have pushed the issue, because I was concerned all the way along.
Thank you for appearing at the City Club today. both you and Mr. Butterfield's testimony did something to me which has never happened before or after. I was totally speechless. I think you've answered this in part, but perhaps you can expand on it. If what happened in Watergate was happening today, with all your experience over the years, what would you have done differently, if anything?
Well, you know what the odd thing is, someone like myself is probably more qualified to be White House counsel today than I was when I was there. And I would brace a president today with the first inkling. And the other thing is, I think other White House counsel learn from my experience. We did a CLE where two White House counsel who followed me at the White House attended them. One, Beth Nolan, attended one in Washington, and Craig Craig, who was the most recent with Obama, he attended also, and they both said, and I asked them, I said, did you, one, have somebody who was a criminal law expert on your staff? Well, Craig Craig has that experience. Beth did not, but both did say they had very sophisticated people who were looking out for these sorts of issues on their staff to make sure that those problems did not become a problem for a president. So that precedent alone has changed the way White House counsel operates. But I would have been much more aggressive much earlier. It's very interesting with the White House staff. You really are selected to be very loyal to the president, and that was one of the first questions I was asked when Haldeman hired me. He said, "Can you be loyal to the president and not John Mitchell?" I wasn't particularly close to Mitchell. I was more hired on my merits. The reason I got over to the White House was because Mitchell himself and the Deputy Attorney General, Dick Kleindienst, didn't particularly like to do White House briefings. They found me a quick study on subjects, and so they would send me over to do background briefings. And as a result of that, I met an awful lot of the White House staff. And when Ehrlichman became the head of the domestic council, they asked me if I was recommended as the person to come over as White House counsel. I think also that they wanted somebody who was young. One of the interesting things that happened along the way is one day a fellow who had been assigned to my staff by the name of Jack Caulfield came in my office wide-eyed. And Jack was a former New York City detective and not wide-eyed about very many things at all. He'd seen it all. And he said, "John, Chuck has ordered me to firebomb the Brookings Institute." I said, "What?" He said the president is convinced there are copies of the Pentagon Papers in the Brookings Institute, and that they won't turn them over, so the way to get them is to firebomb the place, and when the police arrive, to send a team in to crack the safe. I said,
Colson is the guy you're talking about.
And Chuck Colson is the person who indeed had given these instructions to Caulfield. I said, "Jack, don't do anything." I got on the next flight out to California to San Clemente, where my superiors were at that point, to tell them I thought this was insane. I also pulled the code down and realized it was a capital offense in the District of Columbia if anybody dies as a result of arson. And so I pitched my case. Ehrlichman very calmly picked up the telephone. The White House operator said, "Get me Chuck Colson." He said to Colson, "Young counsel Dean is out here. Doesn't think that the Brookings idea is a very good one, John, so cancel it." Then turns to me, says, "Anything else, counselor?" I said, "Thanks, John. That'll handle it this morning." And I headed back to Washington. So I was able, the clear question is some things are right and wrong, and that was clearly wrong. When you got into the nuanced areas of obstruction of justice, and doing this book I'm going through right now, one of the things I'm trying to figure out is when did I cross the line? And these aren't bright light crimes, and it's been very difficult figuring that out, when I crossed the line personally. No question I crossed it, but I just wasn't, I just had to piece together when that happened. And that's where it helps so much to have somebody who is alert and experienced in the criminal law, who's there, who can anticipate these sort of things. Question, please.
Hi, my name is Zoe, and I come from Montessori High School at University Circle. I was just wondering, when you talk about Nixon and the other side of Nixon and how he might not have been as bad a guy as the people were concerned that he was, if not politically, then like emotionally or kind of personally. Yes, thank you. So I was wondering if you look at the inherent nature of humans and how they look at the the present situation that they're in, and they determine how to judge people based on that, as you can see in the voting of incumbent presidents. How would you relate that to Nixon and how he was judged?
One of the things that surprised me about, a couple things surprised me about the presidency. One is when one president leaves, he literally cleans the files and takes everything that is his. This really is a tradition. Very few so-called professional civil servants stay at the White House. So everybody has to sort of reinvent the wheel when they arrive. And they reinvent it based on their experience in the campaign. So it's highly political when the White House team comes in. One of the things I've long thought should be done is that more professional staff, like, say, with a prime minister, stay in the White House for the institutional continuity. The institutional memory right now is in the Office of Legal Counsel, certainly for legal matters and for a lot of other matters, and then a handful of other people stay. Some of the secretarial pool will stay. They know the forms and formats that the traditional memos follow and what have you. So in essence, right now, every White House and every president starts from scratch and invents it. And I think that's a flaw in the system where that continuity could help an awful lot, be it a Nixon, be it an Obama. They all, as I say, this on-the-job training is about as tough as possible. And you notice that when you look over the problems. Another thing is that presidents in their first term really have one predominant thought. That is, how am I going to win the second term? They trim their sails on some issues. They fill them out on others to try to not only capture their base, but to attract new voters. It is clearly a highly political office. The White House staff itself is hired because it has good political antenna to spot. No president can make every single decision. There are too many. There are just too many things that can't be solved out in the departments and agencies, make their way to the White House, and there are always good issues. There are always important issues when they get that far, because they couldn't be resolved in the agencies and the departments. Yes, the president will put out his general policy, and cabinet officers can follow them, but often there's a conflict between cabinet officers. So you get these kind of conflicts, and a surprising number of decisions are made, not by the president, but by his staff in his name as to what they believe the president would want in that circumstances, and 99% of the time they're right. One of the things that happened with Watergate, it was totally out of the staffing system. When I first mentioned let's hire a criminal lawyer, was my first sign that this wasn't going to be done in any kind of normal way. It's when things fall outside the staffing system, which is very good in the White House. They have, over the years, as I say, that core staff that does stay has developed processes that are very good. The National Security Council being the highest level of holdovers, but it really goes across the board. So there's a very good decision-making apparatus there. It's when things fall out of that apparatus that you tend to get problems. And to institutionalize everything, to me, would seem like a very good idea. Does that answer your question broadly? Good.
First of all, I enjoyed and appreciate your presentation far more than I thought I would. And I'm very impressed by it. It'll do well on the road, I'm sure. My question, do you know what happened to the missing minutes? And if so,
the 18-and-a-half-minute gap. The 18-and-a-half-minute gap is one of those issues that people keep asking about. You know, having gone through the tapes now, I find a very consistent pattern in Nixon dealing with his staff. Anything that is important, he tends to repeat once, twice, sometimes 3 times, but always at the end of the session, sort of what he wants that staff member to take away. With the 18-and-a-half-minute gap, which is the first recorded conversation after the arrests at the Watergate that he has with Bob Haldeman when he gets back, nobody ever listened to the total tape. They ran into the gap and said, oh my, this must have been incredibly damaging because it's gone. I'll come back in just a minute to why I think it was gone. But as far as the substance, Haldeman, the reason they knew it related to Watergate because his notes tracked very closely with what was said before and what was said after. And in the middle, this Watergate part is all about public relations, that he thinks that Haldeman should do something about the fact that they have been told that some of their facilities are bugged, some of the PR aspects of it, and it's not particularly sensational. It's the sort of thing that just sort of mechanical things. But what's interesting is he comes back to the identical points at the end of the tape. So I'm convinced there was really nothing terribly sensational. And as we spend all this money trying to find out what was in that 18-and-a-half-minute gap, we're going to be deeply disappointed if they ever can recover it, because I don't think there's anything there. There are too many other tapes for Nixon who listened to some of these tapes and who did not listen to that one, incidentally. There is just absolutely no evidence that he listened to that particular tape or that he had that tape in his hand. So I don't think it was him. I did initially. I thought it because it was so clumsy the way it was done. It was done 7 to 9 times it took to erase. And Nixon was not a very mechanical man. He hadn't driven a car in years. I always marveled at, the medicine bottles where you had to push down and then turn them. He just could not open that bottle. He'd have it in his teeth, and he'd be trying to twist it. I mean, he just couldn't get. Someone would show him, he just couldn't get the. So these weren't his kind of. This wasn't his forte as to how to push a button, even 7 to 9 times. So what I'm after talking to the players involved, all but Rose Woods, who had passed away by the time I had a chance to really think about this. Steve Bull, who had the machine and took them in and queued them up. This machine had a history of trouble, and I think it was the machine. It looked clearly to be intentional, but I don't believe it was anything other than accidental. So I think that it's one of those things that the media got a hold of, and the timing of it was terrible, and that added to the excitement about what it was. So I think it's going to, if we ever recover it, be a huge disappointment. But I don't know if technically we ever will.
By the way, there are so many tapes that week where Nixon is told about what's going on, that Liddy did it, and all the rest of that stuff, that you've got a ton of evidence in that first week that would be incriminating. And so this one little 18-minute gap, it would have had to have been something extremely sensational, because the rest of it kind of shows he knows what's going on. So.
Yeah, in our seminar, we actually decided to play segments of the tape. They're hard to hear, so we do pass out transcripts. But when we do the full program, they do make some very nice points. And I now have access to tapes and have prepared transcripts of stuff that nobody has heard. So it has added to our program. Question, please.
Yes. I don't think enough credit is given to Woodward and Bernstein in their series of articles. And I'm wondering, you being in the White House at that particular time, I would think you were reading materials. And I was wondering what was going through the White House that those things were coming out, and was there speculation on who Deep Throat was?
Well, there's no question that because of the movie All the President's Men, the Woodward-Bernstein story got distorted, it got mythologized, and what have you. They did a wonderful job of reporting. And I know their editor, Barry Sussman, who put them on the case. I know Ben Bradley. I'm doing a number of programs with him as we approach the 40th. They'll be the first to tell you they didn't crack the case, as the myth would have them cracking the case. What they did do, and what's so exceptional, is one, they did great shoe leather reporting. If they weren't, occasionally they were in front of the FBI. Most cases they were behind the FBI. But they just went to the same sources that the FBI went to because it was a fairly limited universe. So what their reporting did is, Washington Post was the only paper that was really next to the New York Times, read closely in Washington. It was read by the House and the Senate. It was read by the judges, read by the prosecutors. And they did something nobody else did. They kept the story on the front page, or close thereto, throughout the entire duration. They made it an important story. This kept it, the investigation, in other words, going, recognizing what the investigation was uncovering. It was very much a Washington story. Television, I've gotten to know George McGovern over the years, and George said, I couldn't get two newspaper reporters to sit in a room to listen to me talk and ask questions about Watergate. No one cared. Walter Cronkite at CBS did occasional stories based on Woodward and Bernstein's reporting. So they really owned the story. Not until the spring of 1973, when Watergate literally falls apart, does the rest of the national media pick the story up. The New York Times was there at day one. They do a few stories along the way, but not like the Post that really focused on the story. And Ben Bradley, in both publicly and privately, has said, I just knew enough about Nixon to sense that this was the Nixon story, that these sorts of things don't happen if it's not authorized by the person on the top. And he said, for that reason, I wasn't about to let Reddit go of the story, and he never did.
Just one question. Did you speculate about...
We're out of time.
Did you speculate about...
On Deep Throat, I will come to that.
John, you're out of time.
We're out of time. Last question is, it is Mark Felt, and read the book Leak by Max Holland. He's done a wonderful job of explaining it wasn't a very noble motive.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a special Encore Speakers Forum featuring John Dean and Jim Robenalt. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.